It was a disappointing year for the Falcons edge rushers, but there's a bright spot with Arnold Ebiketie. Who else will step up in 2023? Or will the Falcons have to bring in outside help to boost their pass rush?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. The only thing more exciting than the big game is the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya. There's only 6 days left until the Super Bowl. Ariya ready? The Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Learn more at nissanusa.com. Guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Just download the Locked On Sports Atlanta app, and you'll get Locked On Falcons on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So today we're continuing our breakdown of each position group on the defensive side of the ball from the 2022 season, continuing from the D-line yesterday to the edge rushers today. And overall, I would say that this edge rusher group was disappointing, especially when I went back and listened to my season preview back in early July, is sort of in projecting some of the stats that I thought the edge rushers alone would produce, sort of having a median projection for the Lorenzo Carter and Arnold Ebiketie, Ade Ogundeji, and DeAngelo Malone combining for 17 sacks and 116 pressures, which was nearly double of what their 2021 production was from that group that consisted of guys like Steven Means and Ogundeji and others, Dante Fowler, where they only had 8.5 sacks and 68 pressures. Well, they fell well short of my projections and were marginally better than that 2021 group, with the 4 edge rushers combined for 9.5 sacks and 74 pressures this year. So certainly a disappointment, marginal improvement from the group, but considering the perception, at least we had going into the season, that there was a significant infusion of talent to this group, well short of expectations. But I don't think that reflection of the group as a whole is necessarily a reflection on all the individuals, which include Arnold Ebiketie, who I think flashed a lot this past season. One of the conversations that we had throughout the season, a lot of people were asking me, like, what are my thoughts on Arnold Ebiketie? And like, I thought he showed enough early in the season that made me feel like he was on a pretty solid trajectory. Then unfortunately late in the season, he got injured against Washington, injured his forearm, missed a game against the Bears, and his production after that point was minimal. Through those first 11 games going into that Washington game before suffering his injury, he had 26 pressures, which would have put him on pace for about 40 pressures over 17 games. And I think my preseason projection for what he was going to be this year was about 38 pressures. So he was on pace to sort of match or exceed my expectations this year. And he had 2 pressures against Washington, but according to PFF, he had no pressures after that game, after suffering that injury. Although my own film study did give him credit for a couple of hurries against Baltimore and Tampa Bay down the stretch. But I think when you look at Ebiketie's season, it's not disappointing. The injury, I think, kind of derailed things. So the numbers don't necessarily live up to what we hoped they would be. But you saw some very promising performances from Ebiketie sprinkled throughout the middle of the season. That 49ers game where he kind of dominated the 49ers third string left tackle, which is something that you want to see. He had a couple of other early games, like against Cleveland, where he got a lot of pressures in that game. Some of that, a lot of that was like, unblocked pressure or scheme pressure or those things. But, I think when it came to my assessment of Ebiketie, and again, going back to a question I was asked frequently throughout the season, was sort of what my thoughts were. And it wasn't that I thought he was like winning a ton, but I liked the fact that he was trying different things. He was trying to win with technique and pass rush moves rather than having to rely solely off of his, athleticism, his speed, his power. And that was one of the things I liked about Arnold Ebiketie when I contrasted him coming out of the draft, and was much more optimistic about his future in Atlanta than I was with guys like Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley and what they could become in terms of their future future in the NFL, because those guys were primarily guys that were relying on their athletic gifts. Beasley with his speed, Tack with his power, and that's fine, but you're so reliant on matchups, and those guys tended to be hot and cold, because if you're not facing a favorable matchup, you're not facing a guy that's susceptible to your speed, like in the case of Beasley, or someone who's susceptible to power in the case of Tack McKinley, you're not going to win very much. But the guys that are technical pass rushers, and this is what I liked about Arnold Ebiketie, where a lot of his production in college came from technique and pass rush moves rather than just pure athletic gifts, those guys tend to fare much better long term in the NFL, because those guys can be any variety of offensive tackles. Slow-footed guys, powerful guys, it doesn't matter. They're going to use moves and technique that all offensive linemen tend to be susceptible to, as opposed to just pure physical gifts. So I'm still very optimistic about Ebiketie's future, even if the production wasn't quite to the degree that we wanted it to be. My main concern with Ebiketie moving forward is just going to be how he meshes with the type of scheme that Ryan Nielsen wants to run, the new Falcons defensive coordinator. Ebiketie was not a great run defender at Penn State. He wasn't a great run defender as a rookie. He was up and down. He had some positive moments, just a little bit too inconsistent. But when you look at the type of edge rushers that typically fit in that Saints scheme, they tend to like bigger guys that are like 265 plus, because in large part they want their edges to be 3-down players, because they're going to play with a lot of softer boxes, and they're going to need 6 guys to be able to do the job that in a quote unquote traditional defense 7, maybe even 8 guys can do. And so size matters in that case. And Ebiketie's about 256. Was measured in like 250 at the combine or whatever. So, it goes back to a conversation I had with John Owning of PFF after the draft, and something I mentioned myself on my Arnold Ebiketie scouting report, which is like, I do think him bulking up, getting to 260 plus pounds will benefit his game in the long run, not only as a pass rusher, but also as a run defender, because as a pass rusher, he can start to be more effective utilizing the power element of his game, which was not necessarily something that was a frequent weapon for him at Penn State. And so maybe it can be a little bit more in the NFL if he can put on a little bit more mass. So I think Ebiketie is on pace to being the guy that he's or at least I thought he would be or could be in the NFL. And if to remind you guys of sort of, my evaluation of him, my eye level for Arnold Ebiketie was Harold Landry. My ceiling for him was DeMarcus Lawrence. And I think sort of he's on that path to be one of those two guys, or, somewhere in between, whatever. And to me, we'll sort of look at how big a jump he makes from year 1 to year 2 to kind of determine which trajectory he is on. But I'm feeling pretty good about Arnold Ebiketie moving forward. It's just going to be a question of how good a player he's going to be. That's a similar question that we're going to ask about the rest of the group, because I'm not feeling as great about that group as a whole. And we'll talk about Lorenzo Carter, DeAngelo Malone, and Ade Ogundeji to continue today's episode. I want to tell you about PrizePicks, a fun new way to play daily fantasy. And you can pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. Used to be only 5 players and 10 times your money. Now it's 6 with 25 times your money. And the great thing about PrizePicks, it's just you versus the projections. You're not competing against other people. And they offer projections on NFL, NBA, NHL, college sports, WNBA, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, esports, everything you could possibly imagine. PrizePicks is safe, it's fast, it's easy. It's currently in operation in over 30 states in the US and Canada. All you got to do is download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That means if you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you another 100 to play with. If you deposit 50, PrizePicks will give you 50. So don't forget that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. So continuing talking about the rest of the edge rushers, DeAngelo Malone, Lorenzo Carter, Ade Ogundeji, basically the summary of my thoughts on them, I don't have as much confidence in what they can contribute at this edge rusher group moving forward as I do with Arnold Ebiketie. And so that's going to be something that I do think the Falcons are going to probably wind up adding some help there, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the offseason or in this episode when it comes to this offseason. But let's start talking about Lorenzo Carter and going back to that episode 7 months ago where I gave my projections. I had projections for Lorenzo Carter of 7 sacks and 44 pressures. He finished the year with 4 sacks and 33 pressures. So again, not quite living up to those expectations in terms of my median projections, just more on the low end of things. And I think in terms of what Carter was able to contribute this year, he was a decent pass rusher. He can do a lot of the coverage stuff that you wanted in the DMP scheme that used a lot of Sims and creepers. And I think for the most part, he lived up to those expectations. And for someone who needs a refresher on what I mean by Sims and creepers, typically when you're blitzing, you're bringing, an extra defender, 5-6 guys, all right, from that second level linebacker, safeties, corners. But those Sims and creepers are when you're bringing still 4, but you're bringing one of those extra defenders from the second level, but you're often dropping a guy to replace those guys in coverage. And Lorenzo Carter's athleticism and ability to play in space made him sort of a perfect fit in that. And we saw him make a couple of really positive plays in coverage this year. That pick 6 he had on that screen pass in the first Carolina game really stands out as one of the highlight plays of his season. They did try to utilize him a little bit more as a traditional off-ball Sam linebacker when the Falcons were mixing in their 4-3 underfronts in the back half of the season. He didn't look as natural doing that as he did, in their sort of 3-4 defense. And that's kind of where I see Carter kind of fitting with a move away from the 3-4. And again, I know I often say people overrate that 3-4 versus 4-3 defenses, but I just don't think Carter's really an ideal fit as a 4-3 defensive end, going back to similar issues with Arnold Ebiketie, not necessarily having the bulk that you want to just mix it up with some of these offensive tackles. And I think he's just a little bit more natural fit. So I'm not expecting Carter to return to Atlanta. He could as a role player, but I'm expecting him to seek out a starting opportunity elsewhere and probably starting money in free agency as he hits the market this offseason. So I do think we're likely to see Lorenzo Carter's time in Atlanta done. I think he was a solid, addition for the team, giving the team pretty decent bang for their buck, relatively speaking. But, I think that's kind of where it ends for him. Now, part of the reason why I think the Falcons, 6 months ago would have felt fine moving on from Lorenzo Carter, and that was kind of my expectation at that point, and my expectation now is because the expectation that DeAngelo Malone could easily slide into that role. But again, Malone doesn't necessarily fit in terms of the ideal 4-3 defensive end. He's even smaller than Arnold Ebiketie in that 240 plus range. In terms of his 2022 season, I think we did see some flashes from DeAngelo Malone, some positive plays from him. But, again, that's kind of living up to my expectation. I didn't think we would see a monster production. I thought we would maybe see a little bit more production in terms of pressures and whatnot. I think I projected him for 14 pressures this year. He had 7. So, and when we talk about Malone's, trajectory and potential, the ceiling player I projected for him was Yannick Ngakoue. I'm not as confident that he's going to reach that ceiling, but we'll see in terms of that. I think more likely based off of his first year, I feel like he's more on the path to where his floor comp was, which was Marquise Haynes, the outside linebacker for the Carolina Panthers. And again, Malone's a little bit too much of a tweener. He's not necessarily big enough to be, or physical enough to be, a hand in the dirt defensive end. He's not as quite comfortable playing in space to be more of that off-ball Sam linebacker. And there was a similar player in New Orleans in Zach Bond that they drafted in the 3rd round back in 2020. And he's barely played the last 3 years in New Orleans. I think averaging about 127 snaps a year over the last 3 years. And we all talked about how Malone needed more snaps, and he played 216, I believe, snaps this past year. So Bond can't even get on the field that much. And so I kind of see Malone sort of settling in as more of a situational pass rusher, that in certain situations you can put him on the field, let him use his speed maybe to rush the quarterback a little bit. But I think he's more of a role player, probably a guy that's going to have to carve out a role on special teams, because I just don't know if he's going to have a firm role on Sundays as part of the regular defense moving forward, because I don't know if he's a great fit for what the Falcons want to do moving forward. So we'll see what develops for him. We'll see exactly what role there is for DeAngelo Malone, but I still think of him as a guy that can be a contributor, but more as a role player than necessarily a guy that might be a real starter for the Falcons moving forward. Another role player is Ade Ogundeji, and I've never been super high on Ade Ogundeji, especially as a pass rusher. I always thought it was limited in that regard because he just lacked explosiveness. He was a guy that was always going to have to win with length and technique. And after 2 seasons, we really haven't seen Ade grow a lot from a technical standpoint. And maybe Ryan Nielsen, given his specialty of developing defensive linemen can get more out of him, and we'll see if we can see a major jump for Ade moving forward. But he's kind of an adequate run defender and a below average, this is probably being kind in a lot of ways, pass rusher at this point in his career. And I think potentially he has an uphill battle to make the Falcons roster in 2023 if they wind up making some of the moves this offseason that I expect them to make, which again, I expect Ebiketie and Malone to definitely be back on the team next year. I expect them to probably sign a free agent edge rusher as well. And we'll talk about, some options there for them to wrap up today's episode. And I think there's probably a pretty good to very good chance that they wind up drafting another edge rusher. And those 4 guys will probably be ahead of Ade on the roster. And I don't know if you're going to keep, more than 4 edge rushers heading into the season unless Ade can make a significant year 2 to year 3 jump. And we'll see if he's able to do that. My thoughts on Ade is very similar to the thoughts I expressed yesterday, talking about the D-line group, talking about Abdullah Anderson, where like as the 8th or 9th man, that last or second to last guy in your rotation, they're fine in that role. But unfortunately for Ade, similar to what we saw with Anderson in this back half of the season after Taquan Graham's injury, with Ade, injuries, to Dante Fowler a year ago, as well as, not necessarily having that fast development for Ebiketie and Malone, has led to Ade basically in each of the last 2 seasons getting the 3rd most amount of snaps among the Falcons front line guys. And that's just too high on the depth chart for what little contributions he's bringing to the table. So we'll see if he can make a jump this year to be more than that. But again, I think he's going to be facing an uphill battle to make the roster. So clearly, as I said earlier, I don't have a ton of confidence in the contributions from anybody at this edge rusher group beyond Arnold Ebiketie. And so that, of course, means that I think the Falcons, if they're going to get significantly better contributions, which we want to see, they're going to have to look for that outside help that we referred to, to talk about Quentin Bell and David Anini. I'm not expecting those guys to be major contributors, although, again, maybe they surprise me in training camp or something like that, but they're probably not going to move the needle a ton. So I expect the Falcons to revamp this edge rusher position in the offseason, and I think that starts with free agency, and we'll talk about some options like a Marcus Davenport and why he makes a ton of sense for the Falcons, among other options, as we wrap up today's episode. But first, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Built Bar. And everybody wants to eat healthier this time of year. And maybe you're like me, and you don't want to compromise on taste. And so Built Bar is the thing for you, because they're the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. And the thing that makes Built Bar so good is they're covered in 100% real chocolate. And you can check out flavors like peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, or some of my all-time favorites. And not only do Built Bars taste good, they're healthy too. Only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And for years, we've told you to head on over to built.com to order yourself a box. And you can still check them out at built.com to check out new flavors or sales. But more importantly, you can now check out Built Bars at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart and walk to the pharmacy section and grab a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. And if you're at Sam's, run in and grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter or churro. Trust me, guys, you will thank me later. So I do expect the Falcons to add significantly more help at this edge rusher group in free agency and probably also the draft. I know a lot of focus is going to be on we got to draft. And let me make it clear, I am not against the idea of taking an edge rusher early in the draft. I'm very much in favor of it. But I want to reiterate the point I stressed on yesterday's episode, that when you're talking about the draft, you're talking about guys that are probably going to have a bigger impact in 2025 than they are going to have in 2023. And so if you're looking to see a big, shot of adrenaline in this pass rush heading into 2023, and you're tired of the 17 sack season or 18 sack season that we had 2 years ago and the 21 sack season that we had last year, you need to be focused more primarily on free agency. And obviously Marcus Davenport is going to be probably one of the top targets for the Falcons. Unfortunately, comparatively to the interior D-line group that we talked about last year and how deep that free agent class is, edge rusher is not as deep. And that may drive the Falcons to be a little bit more aggressive going after a guy like Marcus Davenport. And we're not going to do a super deep dive on Marcus Davenport on today's episode, although we will probably devote a full episode or so to him as we get closer to free agency. And I know a lot of people are not necessarily high on the idea of signing Marcus Davenport because they look at his sack totals and they see only 0.5 sacks from 2022. He did have 9 sacks in 2021, but they also see the 1.5 sacks that he had in 2020. And they're like, that's not necessarily the guy for us. But the thing I will always continue to stress is while I think sacks are a very meaningful stat when it comes to assessing teams. So when you look at the Falcons sack total, that is a very accurate reflection of their overall pass rush. I don't think it's a great way. It's a flawed way, in my opinion, of assessing individuals because sacks tend to be very volatile for the individuals. And we here on Locked On Falcons are very much pro pressures when it comes to assessing the individual. But when it comes to Marcus Davenport, I thought PFF over the weekend did their top 100 free agent rankings, and they had Davenport number 20 on that. And their blurb that they wrote on Davenport, I thought was a very good one that kind of summarizes my thoughts. So I'll post that on the screen as a screenshot, and I'll read it to you guys. They had Davenport 20th in their top 100 rankings. They wrote, injuries once again hampered Davenport's season, but he's a remarkably effective pass rusher off the edge when healthy, and his talent alone could be worth the gamble in free agency, especially given the relative lack of edge rushers available. Since he entered the league in 2018, Davenport's 17.8% pass rush win rate and 13.9% pressure percentage are both top 20 marks among edge defenders. And he's also earned a very respectable 82.1 run defensive grade for his career, which ranked 16th over that span. Davenport has 5 straight campaigns grading above 70. The issue is that he's yet to log 600 snaps in a single season. At the end of the day, top 20 edge defenders against the pass and run don't reach free agency often. And while his injury list is long, it doesn't include any devastating ligament tears. So they also give a projection for what Davenport's contract will be, and it's a 1-year, $12 million deal with about $10 million in guarantee. So I think it's interesting with that projection because you can draw some parallels between Marcus Davenport, given his injury history, with a Jadeveon Clowney, right? And Clowney, when he, played in Houston, had an extensive injury history. And because of that, Clowney has, since leaving Houston 3-4 years ago, has basically signed a series of 1-year contracts with multiple teams that over the last 4 years has totaled about $46 million, which on average is about $11.5 million per year, which is about where they are projecting Davenport's contract. So I feel like he's kind of in that sort of range where you can sign him to a 1-year prove it type of deal, and Davenport can, potentially earn a multi-year contract if he can stay healthy and have his sack production sort of rebound. But again, I think he's a perfect fit. He knows the scheme. He has the size. He has the pass rush ability. He has the run defense ability. To put him opposite an Arnold Ebiketie up front in this unit makes a ton of sense. He's not the only option for the Falcons at edge rusher in free agency this offseason. You do have Jadeveon Clowney. You have Yannick Ngakoue, we talked about earlier. Charles Omenihu's another guy. You got some guys that maybe cap cuts like Frank Clark, Bud Dupree, Carl Preston Smith. Heard some buzz that, the Vikings may decide to part ways with Zadarius Smith or Danielle Hunter, although I've also heard some talk that that's not likely, but we'll see how that develops. And so there may be better options come March when we get to free agency in terms of edge rushers beyond Marcus Davenport. So we'll see if the Falcons, but I do think it makes a ton of sense for the Falcons to bring in a player like Davenport, especially if they can get him on one of those 1-year prove-it deals. We saw how effective that worked for the Falcons several years ago when they signed Adrian Claiborne after he had an injury-plagued, rookie contract with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he turned out to be one of the better pass rushers for the Falcons over the last decade, which again is not saying a ton, but again, I think it's something where it's a relatively low risk, reasonably high reward when it comes to Marcus Davenport. So we'll see what the Falcons do in free agency in March. We'll also see what the Falcons do in the draft come April. And, I think the edge rusher conversation is going to be an interesting one because right now it does not seem like the NFL is as high on these edge rushers as I think, a lot of late season mocks were sort of projecting them. And we had, 3 edges consistently being mocked in the top 5 to 10 picks, throughout December and early January. And those guys were Will Anderson of Alabama, Miles Murphy of Clemson, and Tyree Wilson of Texas Tech. And it does not appear, at least the trend right now is not headed that that's going to be the case. That seemingly teams are not as high on Miles Murphy as maybe we previously thought. It seems like he's the guy that consistently is getting left out in the cold. You saw that with Daniel Jeremiah dropping his top 50 board last week, and he had Murphy at 18 on that. You had Dane Brugler of The Athletic mocking Murphy to 14 in his mock from 3 weeks ago. It doesn't seem like the NFL is as high. So we'll see how that turns out. What is notable about Daniel Jeremiah's top 50 is that he had Keon White, the Georgia Tech pass rusher. I wouldn't call him an edge rusher, at 8th in his top 50. But it's notable that we haven't seen a ton of Keon White being mocked in round 1. Like DJ did not have him in his mock round 1 mock, nor did Bucky Brooks or Eric Edholm of NFL.com. I think Kuiper's the only one I've seen, at least of the major outlets, that have had Keon White in his first round, and that was at 19 to the Bucks. So it's notable because DJ is basically his adage is like, my top 50 is what I see, based his own evaluation, and his mock drafts are based off what he hears from the various plugged in people and how the NFL sees things. So to me, it's more notable to me that he didn't mock Keon White in the first round than it is that he's ranking Keon White in his top 10 because, frankly, my opinion is like, I'm going to do my own evaluations of players. So like, I don't really need to rely on other people's evaluations. I'm curious about them, but it's not something that I pay as much attention to as I do with these guys that do the mock drafts, that are actually talking to NFL scouts and NFL insiders and have at least a better idea than the rest of us peasants out there when it comes to what the NFL teams think and will do with these players. So that's going to be an ongoing conversation, particularly with this draft class. I do like this edge rusher group, but similar to the D-line group, I don't think it's as top heavy as maybe previously thought, and rather like the value is going to be in rounds 2, 3, 4, and potentially 5. And I think that would be a great opportunity for the Falcons to potentially find some guys in that range of the draft, where we've seen teams like the Saints in the past find guys like Trey Hendrickson and Carl Granderson and those type of guys that can come in and be developmental options for the team there, as opposed to pulling the trigger in round 1 or whatever. So we'll see. Miles Murphy has that connection to this coaching staff. His position coach at Clemson was Nick Eason, who was a position coach with Arthur Smith in Tennessee. So we'll see how that goes. And maybe the Falcons are much higher on Miles Murphy than the rest of the NFL seems to be, at least at this point in time. But that's part of the reason why over the last week you've heard me talk a little bit more about the idea of the Falcons. We seem to be headed toward, at least in my opinion, sitting here today, in a direction that the Falcons may go corner in round 1 at 8, as opposed to edge rusher, which I think has been the presumptive favorite for several weeks and months now. So we'll see. That's kind of me planting my early flag in early February, similar I did 2 years ago when it came to Kyle Pitts at 4, and everybody was like, "This is crazy. Kyle Pitts at 4, that's ridiculous." And I was like, no, it makes perfect sense. If the Falcons aren't necessarily going to go quarterback at 4, then taking Kyle Pitts, who the perception was at that time that he was the best non-quarterback in that draft class, made total sense to me. So we'll see if I can similarly crow about being relatively early on the cornerback at 8 bandwagon, or if I have to change that opinion by the time we get to April. So we'll see. It's a process. It's a 4-month-long process when it comes to the offseason and draft, and it's basically media and fans that are just basically trying to catch up to the NFL. The NFL kind of already, let's not say that everything is like cemented and set in stone, but there's less movement on the NFL side of things than we often perceive. Like, oh, this guy's falling or this guy's climbing up boards. Like, not really. It's really like the NFL is just basically like they already have the puzzle assembled for the most part. And like we just, as outsiders in the media and fans, are just kind of like getting a little jigsaw piece at a time and being able to place it. We got a little nugget here, or we got a little more information here. And so by the time we get to the end of April, we will have a full picture of how the NFL viewed this draft class. But until then, we just kind of have to put one piece at a time. So that's kind of this 4-month long process, which is part of the reason, guys, why I sit here and I say, like, at this point in time in the calendar, obsessing about what the Falcons are going to do in the draft just doesn't make a ton of sense, because you only got a small portion of the puzzle sort of assembled at this point in time. Not to mention the possibility, I'm not going to say likelihood, but the possibility the Falcons don't even have a first round pick this year, right? If they say make a trade for Lamar Jackson or something like that. So I think our focus collectively should be more on March and free agency, because that's where the Falcons are going to make significant waves, whether that's trading for Lamar Jackson, whether that's, going out there and spending $1 bajillion to revamp their pass rush with a Marcus Davenport or Deron Payne or whoever that is. Like, that to me should be the primary focus. But we'll continue to talk about the draft. We'll continue to talk about some more positions on tomorrow's episode, probably the linebackers, and talk in a similar conversation like we did with edge rushers, where it's Arnold Ebiketie and who else. It's probably going to be Troy Anderson and who else, and that who else may similarly be a free agent signing, a former Saint like Caden Ellis or Caden Ellis. I'll figure out tomorrow how to pronounce it. I think it's Ellis. So that will probably be tomorrow's episode. But guys, make sure you check out Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Until then, and for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL. It is, Super Bowl week. And so they're going to be covering the biggest stories around the NFL, including covering that game, sideways and backwards and all that stuff. So make sure you check out Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever else you get your podcasts. Make sure you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, wherever you get your podcasts, all part of Locked On Podcast Network, guys, your team every day.